The candles in Lord Ashfield's dining room burned with the steady confidence of expensive wax, and every woman at the table wore silk, every woman but one. Eliza Marsh stood near the sideboard, in a gown so thin the draught from the service corridor moved through it as easily as thought, her white cap slightly off-center. From an afternoon of bending and carrying, the collar of her dress held together at the neck with a pin that had belonged to her mother. She had come to Ashfield Park 3 months ago as a housemaid, not a parlor maid, a distinction that had been made clear to her on the first morning by the housekeeper, Mrs. Prentice, in a tone that suggested the clarification was a mercy. She carried dishes. She cleared what others did not finish. She kept her eyes directed at the floor or at the middle distance, and she had learned, painfully and quickly, that the middle distance was safer. The dining table seated 14 that evening, and every one of those 14 had at some point in the past fortnight looked through her as if she were the sideboard itself, every one of them but the guest at the far end of the table. She had noticed him the moment he arrived 2 days prior, because he had thanked her when she set down his wine. Not with the distracted half-syllable some gentlemen issued to furniture that had briefly inconvenienced them, but with a full sentence and a pause, his dark eyes settling on her face for a moment that made her hand tighten on the bottle. She had not known what to do with a look like that. She had not known what to do with a look like that in a very long time. His name was Edmund Farley, Baron Colton of Wentham, and Eliza knew nothing else about him except that he held himself as though the room's approval was a thing he had declined rather than failed to earn. She did not know, that evening, that by the following Saturday everything in that dining room would be different. She did not know that the moment being prepared for her was not a humiliation. It only looked like one at the start. The household at Ashfield Park was governed, in all ways that mattered, by Lady Cecilia Morrow, the eldest daughter of the house and its effective mistress since her mother's death 4 years prior. Lady Cecilia was 24, possessed of a great deal of copper-colored hair and a great deal more social confidence, and she had decided before Eliza's first week was out that the new housemaid was a problem requiring management. The problem was not, precisely, Eliza's competence. Eliza was efficient, quiet, and thorough, qualities Lady Cecilia would have welcomed in a girl who looked and spoke the part. Eliza spoke with a diction that occasionally slipped its station, and she had a way of listening to things she was not meant to hear and appearing, afterward, to understand them, which Lady Cecilia found unsettling in a way she could not quite name, and therefore punished. The maid in rags, Lady Cecilia had said to her friend Miss Harriet Voss on the 4th morning, over the breakfast table, while Eliza carried out the cold tea things. The phrase was not precisely accurate. Eliza's dress was not rags. Whim. It was simply old and thin, and in the brutal northern light of the breakfast room visibly repaired in places. Lady Cecilia had a talent for the phrase that did the most work at the least cost, and the description had settled into the household's vocabulary like a coin dropped into a pond. Eliza had heard it. She had kept walking. The household's visiting party that fortnight was composed of Lady Cecilia's circle, namely Miss Voss, who laughed at things 7 seconds after everyone else did, the young Mr. Gay, Pendleton, who was rumored to be pursuing Lady Cecilia with varying success, and Lord and Lady Fenwick, whose importance to the gathering lay in the social weight of their surnames rather than in anything either of them contributed. Baron Colton had been invited at the last, Eliza gathered, because he was a neighbor of Lord Ashfield's, and because Lord Ashfield, who was largely absent in his own study, had pressed for a gentleman to make the numbers even. Lady Cecilia had arranged the seating twice before she was satisfied. Eliza had rearranged the arrangement of the chair cushions once, quietly, because the Baron had been placed with his back directly to the draught from the garden door, and she had not examined why she did it. If you have ever been in a house where your worth was set by someone else, and accepted by everyone around you, you will understand why Eliza moved through Ashfield Park the way she did, carefully, and with her chin at an angle that was not quite pride and not quite defeat, but something between the two that required considerable maintenance to hold. She had not always been a housemaid. That was the truth of it. The piece of her history she kept folded like a letter in the inside pocket of her chest, never entirely closed, never opened where anyone might see. Her father had been a schoolmaster in the village of Corwell, not 12 miles from Ashfield Park. He had educated her alongside his pupils until his sight began to fail, and then past the point of failing, because he had found no reason to stop. She had read Latin at 14. She had kept the school accounts at 16, because her father could no longer manage the columns. When he died, in the third winter after her mother, he left her nothing that could be sold except the books. The books were the only things she had not sold, and she had hidden them in her trunk at the agency, and not told the housekeeper they were there. Miss Voss discovered this on the Wednesday. She had not been looking for anything. She had wandered, in the light-footed, curious way of a young woman with nothing scheduled, into the servants' corridor, and noticed Eliza's door ajar, and she had looked in the way people look when they are accustomed to looking at things that are not theirs. And she had seen the books stacked in the open trunk. There was a Latin grammar, 2 volumes of natural philosophy, a dog-eared copy of a book of poems that had belonged to her mother. She said nothing at the time. She said everything at dinner on Thursday. It was not a loud disclosure. Miss Voss was not theatrical. She said, with the measured tone of someone sharing a curiosity rather than inflicting a wound, that she had made an amusing discovery about one of the housemaids. And she said it at a moment when the first course was being cleared, which meant Eliza was present, 3 steps from the sideboard, holding a tureen. "The maid in rags reads Latin," Miss Voss said. A few heads turned. Lord Fenwick made a sound that was half amusement and half the noise a man makes when he is not paying attention. Lady Cecilia's face did not move, which meant she was controlling it. It was Mr. Pendleton who laughed outright. "Latin, good Lord." Mr. Pendleton shook his head with the air of a man who has found a particularly good joke. "The maid in rags with her Latin verbs. What does she do with it? Conjugate the silver?" More laughter, not unkind laughter precisely, the kind that does not consider whether it is kind. Eliza set the tureen down without breaking anything. Her face was directed at the sideboard, the pin at her collar pressed against her throat, and then there was a sound at the far end of the table. Not a word. Not yet. Ah. Only the deliberate sound of a chair being set down, the particular quiet of a man who has put down his wine-glass with intention, not accident. Baron Colton was looking at Eliza. Not through her. Not past her. At her. With an attention so direct and so unmarked by any of the performance that usually attended a gentleman's notice of a servant, that Eliza felt the back of her neck go warm under her cap. He said nothing. He simply looked for the length of a breath, and then turned back to the table with an expression that was perfectly contained and utterly unreadable. And Eliza did not know what to do with that either. She stayed, for the remainder of the first course's removal, perfectly competent and perfectly still. The following morning was a Friday, and it was gray, and Baron Colton was in the library at 7:30, when Eliza came to lay the fire. She did not see him until she was already inside the room and kneeling at the grate, because he was at the far end by the windows with a book open in his hands, and the curtains were still half drawn, and she had not thought anyone would be there at that hour. She rose immediately and said, "Forgive me, my lord. I did not know the room was occupied." "Do not stop," he said. "The room is cold. The fire is needed." She turned back to the grate and began the work of it with her hands, because the fire-starting kit was in her apron pocket, and the flint was familiar, and she had learned to make her hands useful when her face was otherwise occupied. He said after a long moment, "The books in the trunk are yours." It was not a question. She said, "Yes, my lord, the Latin grammar, my father's. He taught school." There was quiet. She heard him turn a page. "I imagine," he said, "that you understood the conjugation joke better than anyone at that table last night." She almost smiled. She felt it, and stopped it, and directed her attention to the flint. "I understood it, my lord," she said. "I chose not to demonstrate that I did." He was quiet again for longer this time. The fire caught. She sat back on her heels and watched the small flame take hold, and she felt the warmth of it on her face, and did not turn. "A wise choice," he said, "in that company." She rose and gathered her things, and said, "I will leave you to your reading, my lord. What is your name?" She paused at the threshold, because people in this house called her the housemaid, or occasionally by the phrase Lady Cecilia had coined, and not once since she had arrived had she been asked. "Eliza Marsh, my lord." She heard him say it quietly, once to himself, as though placing it in a location in his memory where it would keep. She left without looking back, because looking back would have cost her something she did not have the budget to spend. The weekend party at Ashfield Park was to culminate in a dinner on Saturday evening more formal than the Thursday gathering, with additional guests invited from the neighboring families. The Mertons from Corwell House, the elderly Lady Ashby Peters, and a young officer named Wickham, who was distantly connected to the Fenwicks. Lady Cecilia had been planning the seating arrangement for a week, and the menu had been changed twice, and the silver had been cleaned to a brightness that was almost punitive in the light. Eliza had been assigned specifically to the service corridor adjacent to the dining room that evening, which meant she would carry dishes and clear courses and remain, throughout, inside the room. She had accepted this assignment with the same expression she brought to all assignments, which was the expression of a woman who has decided that dignity lives below the visible surface of any situation and cannot be removed by another person's decision about where she stands. She laid her dress out on Saturday afternoon and looked at it for a long time. It was the only dress she owned that was not a working uniform. She had bought it 2 years ago from a woman selling her late sister's clothes, and it was cream-colored and empire-waisted, and only slightly too large across the shoulders, and she had altered the shoulders twice, and they were still not right, and the hem had a stain near the left edge that would not come entirely out no matter what she put on it. She put it back in the drawer. The uniform would have to do. At 5:45 that evening, she heard Lady Cecilia instructing Mrs. Prentice in the corridor, and she heard her own name. "I want Miss Marsh visible throughout the service," Lady Cecilia said. "Not in the back corridor. In the room. The Mertons will appreciate the contrast, I think, between a proper household and here," a pause that managed to contain the rest of the sentence without saying it, "Mrs. Dew." Prentice agreed with the tone of a woman who has made the calculation that this is not her battle. Eliza stood at the door of the linen room and felt something very cold and very settled move through her chest. She had been in worse positions. She would set that aside. She would carry the dishes and clear the courses, and keep her eyes on the middle distance, and she would not allow Lady Cecilia the satisfaction of watching her flinch. She was not yet aware that Baron Colton had spoken with Lord Ashfield that afternoon. She was not yet aware that he had stayed for a full hour in the study, or that Lord Ashfield had looked increasingly uncomfortable as the conversation progressed, or that the Baron had left that room with something in his bearing that resembled a man who has made a decision and intends to execute it at the appropriate moment. She knew none of this. She only knew at 6 o'clock that the guests were assembling in the drawing room, and that she had a job to do, and that she intended to do it without breaking. The dinner began pleasantly enough. The soup was served, and the first course came and went, and Eliza moved between the sideboard and the table with the quiet efficiency that had made her useful enough to keep in a household that had decided to find her otherwise amusing. She did not look at the Baron's end of the table. She had resolved not to look at that end of the table, which meant she was aware of it, in the specific way one is aware of a fire burning in a room one is pretending is not warm. Lady Cecilia waited until the second course. She had arranged it. Eliza realized later. The precise angle, the audience, the delivery. It required a hostess's instinct for timing, and Lady Cecilia had that instinct whatever else she lacked. "Mrs. Merton," Lady Cecilia said, addressing the woman at her left with the warmth of shared understanding, "I must tell you, we have made the most singular discovery about our housemaid this week. She reads Latin." Merton looked up with the expression of someone who has not been following closely and is trying to locate the joke. "Can you imagine?" Miss Voss added, performing her role in the program with practiced ease. "Latin. In the servants' quarters. I suppose education does go to waste in the oddest places," said Mr. Cappan. Pendleton, and there was laughter again, the same laughter as Thursday. 7 people, finding the same amusement at the same expense of the same woman, standing 3 steps from the sideboard. Lady Cecilia looked toward the sideboard. Directly the look that said in its directness, "I see you, and this is what you are worth. Eliza," she said, with the particular sweetness that precedes a demonstration, "tell Mrs. Merton what you have been reading." The table was quiet. All 14 faces, together with the faces of 3 other servants at the room's edges, were oriented toward the sideboard. Eliza set down the dish she was holding with great care. She said in a voice that did not shake, "I am not certain it would interest Mrs. Merton, my lady." "Oh, on the contrary," Lady Cecilia said. "I believe it would interest all of us enormously. She reads books above her station. It is quite delightful." The room did not laugh this time. It waited. And then, into the waiting, came the sound of a chair. Not pushed back violently. Not scraped. Moved with purpose. And then the particular quality of silence that precedes a man who has decided to stand. Baron Colton rose from his seat at the far end of the table. He was not a tall man, precisely, not dramatically anything, physically. Yet the room changed when he stood in the way. Rooms change when something they have been arranged around begins to move. He looked at Lady Cecilia first, and his look was not unkind. It was very still. Then he walked the length of the room. Not hurriedly, not with any of the theater a moment like this might have warranted. He walked as a man walks when he knows exactly where he is going and has cleared his path of any possible obstacle in advance. He stopped beside the sideboard. He was facing Eliza. She had not moved. She could not. Quite. Her feet seemed to have made a decision independent of her mind, which was the body's way of registering that something outside the ordinary was occurring. He looked at her for a moment with the same look he had given her in the library, the same directness, the same quality of attention that did not ask permission. And then he turned to face the table. Every face was still. Lord Fenwick had set down his fork. Lady Cecilia's color had changed in a way she would not have chosen. Baron Colton said, "Miss Marsh has read more than the people in this room criticizing her for it." 9 words. 12. If you counted with precision. Set down in the silence as plainly as a document. No one spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not increase the temperature of his delivery. He said it as a man states a fact. He is verified and has no particular interest in debating. Then he extended his arm to Eliza. The gesture was unmistakable. Formal. Period correct. The kind of arm a gentleman offers a woman he is treating as one, in a dining room, in front of 14 witnesses. She looked at his arm for the length of a breath. She felt the color in her face, and the beat of her heart against her collar, and the particular sensation of a moment that cannot be unreceived once it arrives. She took his arm. She felt the steadiness of it through the fabric of his coat, and she understood in a way that had nothing to do with thought that he had known what he was doing when he offered it, and that he had decided to do it long before this moment, and that the calculation had nothing in it of impulse. He led her not out of the room, but to the side of it, to the chair near the window that had belonged to an absent guest. And he drew it out and held it and said, in a voice that was entirely for her rather than for the room, "Sit down. You have been standing for 3 hours." She sat, not because she was instructed to, because there was something in his voice at that particular moment that made sitting feel like the only honest response to what was happening. "Lady Cecilia," said Baron Colton, "I must." "My Lady Cecilia," he said, turning to her with the courtesy intact and the warmth entirely removed. "Your father was good enough to discuss the management of this household with me this afternoon. I expect you will wish to speak with him before the evening is concluded." Lady Cecilia's face stilled. Lord Ashfield, from his seat at the head of the table, cleared his throat and said nothing, which was its own kind of sentence. The dinner continued. It continued in the specific subdued register of an evening that has had its architecture altered and has not yet found a new shape. Eliza remained at the side of the room, near the window, not serving and not quite a guest, holding a position that had no name in any handbook of household management. The other servants moved carefully around the new arrangement, and one of the junior maids caught her eye with an expression that contained something approaching awe, and Eliza looked away before it could do anything to her composure. The Baron ate his dinner. He said very little more. He was not performing for the table. After the courses were concluded, and the guests had begun to move toward the drawing-room, he came to stand near the window where she had remained. "You are wondering," he said, "what that was." "I am trying not to wonder too many things at once, my lord," she said. Something in his face shifted. It was the almost thing she had seen there before, when she said the conjugation line, and it was even more fleeting now, and she stored it in the same interior location. She kept everything she could not afford to examine in the moment. "I would like to speak with you tomorrow morning," he said, "if you will permit it." "I am a housemaid, my lord," she said carefully. "I do not generally have permissions to grant." "Tomorrow morning," he said, "I think you will find the situation has changed somewhat." She did not sleep well. She lay in the narrow bed in the servants' wing and watched the ceiling and thought about nothing, because thinking about specifics required her to make contact with what had happened, and she was not yet certain she could sustain the contact. She thought instead about the fire she had laid in the library. She thought about the way the flame had caught at the third strike, and the smell of it, the clean smell of new wood taking heat. She thought about a voice saying her name quietly to itself, once as though placing it. She slept eventually, and woke to the gray light of a Sunday morning that had not decided what it wanted to be. The kitchen was quiet when she came downstairs. The cook was at the range, and one of the scullery maids was at the sink, and neither of them spoke to her, which was not unusual, except that there was something in the quality of their not speaking that suggested a knowledge they were waiting for her to catch up to. Mrs. Prentice found her in the passage at 7:30. The housekeeper was carrying herself with the specific posture of a woman who has received new information and is not certain how to hold it. She said, without her usual arrangement of rank and instruction, that Lord Ashfield wished to see Eliza in his study at 8 o'clock. Eliza said, "Yes, Mrs. Prentice." She went to the study at 8 o'clock. Lord Ashfield was behind his desk, which was where he preferred to conduct conversations that might require the desk as a kind of structural support. Baron Colton was standing near the window, with his hands folded behind his back, and his expression arranged into something that might charitably be called neutral. Lord Ashfield said, with the particular discomfort of a man, explaining a decision he had been walked toward, rather than arrived at. The Baron had made clear his estimation of the household's treatment of Miss Marsh, and that he himself had, upon reflection, found the Baron's estimation persuasive, and that he wished to offer on behalf of the household an apology and a change in circumstance. He offered her specifically her release from the current housemaid position, a reference of the kind that would open other doors, and, with the Baron's supplementary arrangement, a position in the lending library at Wentham Village, which operated under the Baron's patronage as its assistant keeper. Eliza stood in front of the desk and listened to this with the expression she had brought to everything difficult for the last 2 years, which was the expression of a woman who has learned to receive information before she responds to it. She looked then at Baron Colton by the window. He was looking at her with the same directness she had collected from the library, and the sideboard and the dining room, the same attention that required no performance from her in return. And in that attention she read something she had not allowed herself to name before. It was not pity. It was not charity. It was the specific look of a man who has seen something and thought about it seriously, and decided that seeing it clearly obligates a response. She said to Lord Ashfield, "I accept, my lord, with gratitude." To Baron Colton, she said nothing yet. He had not asked a question that required answering with words. She was given 3 days to make her arrangements. She spent 2 of them in the household, going about her work because she was still employed and the work still needed doing, and she had always found that the maintenance of ordinary tasks was a useful structure during unusual circumstances. On the second evening she was in the servants' hall polishing a set of candlesticks, when the junior maid, who had caught her eye at dinner, came and sat beside her without being invited, and said, in a low, rapid voice, that Lady Cecilia had retired early on Saturday and had not come down for dinner on Sunday. Eliza said. That must be difficult for her, and meant it, in the way one means things that are complicated. The junior maid looked at her as though she had said something in another language. You're not angry, she said. Being angry, Eliza said, returning to the candlestick, requires energy. I have other uses for. On the third morning, Baron Colton came to the servants' entrance, which was not the entrance he would typically use, and asked for her by name. She came out to the small stone courtyard behind the kitchen, where the morning was cold and the sky was the pale gray of a day that might clear or might not. He was standing at the edge of the courtyard with a posture that was not quite at ease, which was the first time she had seen him without it. He said without preliminary, "The library position is real and not contingent on anything. I want that established clearly." "I understand," she said. "What I wish to ask," he said, "is separate, and I will ask it only once, and I will accept whatever answer you give without persuasion." She looked at him across 3 feet of cold morning air and felt her heartbeat in her throat. He said, "I have been paying attention to you since the first evening. I am aware that may not have been comfortable. I am aware that the circumstances in which we have met are not the circumstances in which a person typically chooses to be known. I am not asking you to excuse those circumstances. I am asking whether, when the library position has established itself, and you have had the time to find your footing in it, you would consider permitting me to call on you in the manner a gentleman calls on a woman whose conversation he has found, in 2 brief encounters, to be the most honest he has had in a considerable while." He stopped. He waited. She had spent 2 years not expecting to be chosen, and the body takes longer to catch up to new information than the mind does. And so there was a period of several seconds in which she stood in the cold courtyard and found that she could not make the word she wanted to form come out of her mouth. She said finally, "The conjugation joke." He said, "I beg your pardon." "You laughed," she said. "Not out loud. You heard what I said to you in the library, and you wanted to laugh. I saw it." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I did not," she said. "I found it genuinely amusing. I was not in a position to demonstrate that." "No," he said. "You were not." She pulled her shawl tighter against the morning cold and looked at him steadily. "You may call on me," she said. "When the library is established," he said. "Thank you, Miss Marsh." "Eliza," she said. She said it because he had used it alone in the library, and she had heard it, and she wanted to give it back to him directly. He said, "Eliza," in the voice she had been keeping. She went back inside. The library at Wentham was smaller than she had imagined, and more beautiful. It occupied the lower room of a narrow building on the village's main street, its shelves floor to ceiling and its windows overlooking a row of rowan trees that were, in the early days of her tenure, still holding the last of their autumn leaves. She arrived on a Wednesday morning with her trunk, which a hired cart had delivered the evening before, and the previous assistant keeper, a widower named Mr. Croft, who was retiring to his daughter's house in the south, walked her through the cataloging system with the careful courtesy of a man handing over something he has loved. She worked alone most mornings. She cataloged and repaired and received the village patrons, who came with specific requests and with the slightly suspicious air of people who were accustomed to a different kind of keeper and were not yet sure what to make of her. She answered their requests precisely and occasionally surprised them by knowing what they had been looking for before they had entirely named it. A woman of 60 came in during the 3rd week and asked for something about medicinal plants, and Eliza found her 3 volumes, and then found her the relevant chapters, and then, when the woman confessed she did not read well, sat with her for an hour at the reading table while the afternoon light changed outside the rowan trees. The woman came back the following week. She brought her daughter. Baron Colton came on a Tuesday in November, 3 weeks into her tenure, which was precisely the interval he had proposed. He knocked at the library door and removed his hat when she opened it and said, with an inflection of genuine uncertainty, "I hope I am not interrupting anything important." She looked at the catalog she had been compiling, and the morning's new accessions, stacked on the desk, and said, You are, but I will permit it. He came in. He looked at the shelves with the expression of a man who finds bookshelves personally reassuring, which she had suspected. They talked for 2 hours, but the cataloging system, because she had changed it, and he was curious why. About the Latin grammar, which he had been relieved to learn, was in better condition than she had feared. About his wound, which she had not expected him to name, and which he named in the flat, careful way of a man who has decided that the truth of it is better kept in the light than in the dark. He had lost a younger brother 3 years ago in a dispute that had gone badly, and he had believed himself responsible for not intervening, and the weight of that belief had made him withdraw from most of the social world that expected him to be fully present in it. She listened to this without filling the silence. He left around it. She had learned that silence is the most useful thing you can offer someone who is trying to tell you something that costs them. He said afterward that he had not told that to anyone in 2 years. She said, "I have not told anyone that my father was a schoolmaster, because people here seem to find it confusing." He said, "Why confusing?" "Because it implies I chose to be here," she said. "And most people prefer to believe that people like me arrived at this particular position by not trying." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not the almost thing she had been cataloging. It was a direct thing, arrived at and not performed. He said, "I would like to call again next Tuesday." She said, "I will make sure I am not cataloging anything. Irreplaceable." He came the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. He came through December, when the rowan trees were bare, and the library was cold enough that she wore her shawl over her dress, even in the middle of the day. He came in January, when a brief snow turned the windows white for an afternoon, and they sat at the reading table, and did not, on that particular afternoon, talk about books at all. He told her about Wentham Hall, which he found too large for one person, and not large enough for the version of his life he had hoped to build in it. She told him about Cornwall, about the school, about sitting with her father in the lamplight at the kitchen table, translating passages aloud while the fire went to embers. She told him, in February, about the dress she had not worn on Saturday evening at Ashfield Park. She told him in the plain way she was finding she could tell him things, which was different from the way she told most people things, which was mostly to not tell them. He said, "You could have worn it." She said, "I did not want to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me try." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I understand that she believed him." The difficulty of the weeks that followed was not that anything went wrong. It was that everything was going in a direction she had not trained herself to expect, and her body was considerably better at registering this than her mind was at managing the registration. She found herself aware of him before he was in the room, registering the sound of his step on the stone outside the door, the particular quality of air pressure before the latch moved. She found herself thinking at odd moments of the morning of what she would say when he came, and then, finding when he arrived, that she had said something different, and that the different thing was somehow more honest. He arrived on the second Tuesday in March with snowdrops, not as a presentation. He had them in his coat pocket stemmed down, 3 of them, and he set them on the corner of the reading table without remark, and she looked at them for a moment and then looked at him. And he was looking at the bookshelves. She put them in the glass she used for her morning water. He noticed later and said nothing about it, but his expression at that moment was the direct thing, not the almost thing. And it did not go away when he turned to look at the shelves again. She could not say precisely which Tuesday it was that she understood she was in a difficulty, from which she did not want to be rescued. It had been building with the quiet accumulation of Tuesdays, and one week she arrived at the beginning of the day already looking toward its middle, and she noticed that she was doing it, and she sat with the noticing for a long time. It had been a year since Lord Ashfield's dining room, nearly to the week. He came on a Tuesday in April, and she was at the reading table with the window open behind her, because the morning was warm enough at last to warrant it, and he came in and set his hat on the usual hook and said, "The Mertons have asked after you." "Mrs. Merton," says the village is considerably better served by its library. Mrs. Merton took 3 books in January, Eliza said. She told me at the time she had not read a novel in 6 years. She is reading one now, he said. She seemed pleased and slightly ashamed of being pleased. That is often how it starts, Eliza said. He sat down at the reading table across from her. She did not look up immediately from the catalogue. He said, "Eliza." She looked up. He said, "I would like your permission to speak to Lord Ashfield." She set down her pen. "Lord Ashfield," she said slowly, "has nothing to do with me any longer. Formally speaking," he said, "I know. I am using the form because the form is what I have available and I am aware it is imperfect. And I am asking anyway because what I am trying to say requires something more deliberate than the way I have been saying things." She looked at him across the table, in the library she had learned as her own, with the morning coming through the window and the glass, with the snowdrops from March still on the corner of the table because she had dried them and kept them. "What are you trying to say?" she said. He said, "That I want this to be a permanent situation." She was quiet. The morning had birds in it. "The library position is already permanent," she said. "You said so in the courtyard." "Yes," he said, "I did. I mean something more than the library position." She looked at him for a long moment. "You should know," she said, "that I am not the same woman you saw at the sideboard." "Why?" "I was quieter there than I am when I have a shelf to manage and someone to argue with about cataloging." "I know," he said. "I prefer it." She felt the warmth come into her face and did not look away from it. "Ask Lord Ashfield," she said. "If you feel the form requires it." He came around the table. Not quickly. He came around the way he walked, with direction and without performance, and he stood beside her, and she rose from the chair, because sitting felt wrong at this particular moment, and they were standing in the narrow space between the reading table and the window, and the morning was around them. He said Eliza, and her name in his voice, in that moment, was the same as it had been the first time, low, and placed with care. "Edmund Farley," she said back to him, using his name the first time she had used it, which was its own marked event. He put his hand on hers, which was resting on the back of the chair, and the warmth of it moved through her from the hand upward, and she understood that the body had known long before this and had been very patient with her. "I would like very much," he said, "to make you comfortable." "I am already comfortable," she said. "The library is comfortable, more comfortable than the library." "That," she said, "is a considerable claim." He smiled then. Not the almost thing. A full smile which she had not seen before and which rearranged his face into something that made her understand she had been looking at it all winter without quite seeing it. She turned her hand so that it was holding his. The spring came in through the open window, and the dried snowdrops were on the corner of the table, and the catalogued shelves held their order around them, and she thought that this is what it looks like when a thing finally arrives that you had stopped believing in. It is quieter than you expected. It is warmer. It does not announce itself with spectacle. It comes through an open window on a morning in April, when the rowan trees are beginning to show their first leaves, and it simply stays. Lord Ashfield received the Baron's call the following Thursday, and managed the conversation with the dignity of a man trying not to appear as surprised as he was. Lady Cecilia, Eliza heard later from the junior maid who had kept a correspondence, had made no objection, and had in fact spent a considerable amount of time being seen in charitable works in the weeks since the dinner, which was its own kind of acknowledgment. They were engaged by May. The announcement ran in the county papers with the careful phrasing these things required, and the village received it with the particular warmth of a community that had watched the library come to life under her hands and was prepared to extend the credit of it to her character. Mrs. Merton wrote a note. The wedding was small and held in the church at Wentham in the first week of June, with the rowan trees in full leaf outside the windows. The ceremony was what it was required to be. Thorough, precise, and over, in the way that ceremonies are over, when the thing they mark is already accomplished. Afterward, in the late afternoon quiet of Wentham Hall's drawing-room, she sat in the chair nearest the window with her dress, which was silk and fitted correctly spread around her, and he sat across from her with his coat still on and a cup of tea in his hand, and they were in no hurry. She still had the dried snowdrops. She had put them in the small drawer of the writing desk, in what was now her sitting room, tucked alongside the Latin grammar and the book of her mother's poems. He looked up from his cup and found her looking at him, and did not ask what she was thinking about. He had learned across their Tuesdays that her thinking was her own until she chose to share it, and that she chose to share it freely enough that waiting was not a loss. She was thinking about the thin dress and the pin at her collar and the long cold winter of serving in rooms where no one used her name. She was thinking about the fire in the library grate, and the words placed quietly to themselves, and all the Tuesdays, and how they had accumulated without drama into this particular afternoon, and this particular light, and this particular person across from her. She thought, the world's verdict on a woman is not the final verdict. She had known this in the abstract for most of her life. It was different to know it in a room of one's own. In June, with the windows full of light and the first leaves of summer pressing against the glass. The fire had not been laid yet, it being summer and not yet needed, but the hearth was clean and ready, the way a hearth is ready in a house that expects to be lived in thoroughly. The drawing room was his and now hers, and the books on the shelves were his and soon would be catalogued as hers, and the dried snowdrops were in the drawer, and none of it required a verdict from anyone outside these walls. He set down his teacup and said, "Well," she said. "Well," he said, "I believe this is where we begin." She looked at him in the light of an afternoon that had decided what it wanted to be, and said, "I believe we already have. Thank you for staying until the end. If Eliza's story found its way to you, leave a comment and tell me your favorite moment. She would be glad to know she was heard."